Frederick Douglass' birth in February 1818 in Talbot County, Maryland, was not just the beginning of a man's life, but the start of an odyssey through a shadowed chapter in American history. Born into slavery, Douglass' first experiences were marked by a complete absence of freedom, a concept so foreign that even the word itself would become a powerful tool of resistance later in life. Slavery was not just a system, it was an all-encompassing darkness that consumed every aspect of his existence, from birth to death, unless he could find a way to escape it. The oppressive forces that shaped his early years are those that shaped countless others, but Douglass, by some divine spark of fate or sheer willpower, would eventually outgrow the shackles of both body and mind. However, this was not without immense emotional and psychological cost, a torment that echoed far beyond his own personal struggle. The heart of his early life was a stark and unforgiving plantation, where men and women were reduced to mere tools of labor. Douglass was raised under the supervision of his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, but the love of a grandmother couldn't erase the terror of the overseer's whip or the isolating sense of loss and abandonment. His mother, Harriet Bailey, was separated from him at an early age, a cruel norm for children born into slavery, a cruel norm that severed family ties and relationships, reducing human beings to chattel. The psychological impact of such separations would resonate throughout Douglass' life, creating a void where love should have been, a deep-seated loneliness that can only be understood by those who lived through it. From the moment he could comprehend his surroundings, Douglass felt the weight of his status. He was a slave, not just a person born into the bondage of his body but one whose worth was determined by the whims of his masters. His existence had no inherent value beyond labor. His body was not his own. Douglass recounts a vivid memory of being sent to work on a nearby plantation, where he was exposed to the harsh realities of fieldwork, the unyielding demands of hard labor, and the appalling violence inflicted by overseers. It was on these fields that he first felt the full weight of his dehumanization. To be forced to work from dawn till dusk with nothing more than a scant meal of cornmeal and water, all while under the scrutiny of men who viewed him as nothing more than an animal, forged a bitterness within Douglass that he would never forget. In this hellish existence, the very notion of self-worth was corrupted. Slavery was a system designed to break down any sense of identity, to crush individuality, to make you forget that you were human. But something inside Douglass refused to yield. His desire for knowledge, for a sense of autonomy, grew quietly yet undeniably within him. His transformation from a boy who accepted his lot to a man who sought something greater began in small, seemingly inconsequential moments that would ultimately become pivotal to his escape from both physical and intellectual bondage. When he was sent to Baltimore to serve Hugh Auld, the significance of this event cannot be overstated. It was here that Douglass encountered Sophia Auld, Hugh's wife, who, unlike most others, initially treated him with kindness. It was she who began teaching him the alphabet, a small but extraordinary act that sowed the seeds of Douglass' lifelong thirst for knowledge. Sophia's kindness was both a blessing and a curse. As Douglass quickly learned, any act of kindness towards a slave was considered dangerous, an affront to the dehumanizing institution of slavery. Douglass began to devour books, often in secret, each page an act of rebellion, an act of defiance against the very system that sought to destroy him. But his education came at a cost. Sophia's husband, Hugh Auld, upon discovering that his wife had taught Douglass to read, became enraged. "If you teach that N are to read," he declared, "there would be no keeping him." This chilling statement encapsulates the fear of slaveholders, the knowledge that an educated slave was a threat not just to their authority, but to the foundation of slavery itself. A slave with knowledge could not be easily controlled, could not be kept in the dark about his own humanity. Douglass understood this truth deeply. The more he read, the more he realized the bitter irony of his condition. Slavery, at its core, was a system built on ignorance. Slaveholders feared not just the physical power of slaves but the mental power that came with education. Knowledge was a weapon, and Douglass understood this weapon could either keep him enslaved or set him free. But this realization was not a simple victory. Douglass understood the danger he was courting by learning. His every step towards freedom meant a greater risk of punishment, of retribution. To read and learn was to defy the very existence of slavery. And yet, Douglass could not stop. His education was the catalyst for an inner revolution. It forced him to confront the brutality of the world he lived in, and it shattered the illusion of the justness of slavery. As Douglass began to understand the world beyond the boundaries of the plantation, he began to see himself not as a slave, but as a man, an individual with thoughts, dreams, and the potential for greatness. But the burden of that knowledge was immense. Douglass became acutely aware of how little freedom he truly had. His mind was free, but his body remained in chains. The psychological dissonance between his mental growth and physical imprisonment created a constant tension within him. His longing for freedom was matched only by the brutal reality that his body was not his own to control. Slavery did not just destroy bodies, it destroyed minds. Douglass understood that, too. The emotional and psychological toll of living under such constant surveillance, of being trapped in a system that crushed every ounce of dignity, left deep scars. These scars were not always visible, but they were real. The toll on a person's spirit when their very existence is controlled, manipulated, and commodified is devastating. Douglass' realization that the mind could be liberated even when the body was bound is a theme that would echo through the rest of his life, and it would be the foundation of his later work as an abolitionist and writer. But it also set the stage for the immense inner conflict that would plague him. The soul yearns for freedom, but the body remains shackled. Douglass' journey to liberation would not be just a physical escape, it would require him to free himself from the mental chains that slavery had bound him in. But for all the suffering, there were moments of light. In these early years, Douglass was not entirely alone. Though separated from his family, he found solace in the friendships he formed with other slaves, each one bound by their shared experiences of hardship and despair. These relationships would provide him with strength, even when it seemed there was no hope. Yet, as he grew older and more aware of his surroundings, Douglass understood that his ultimate path to freedom was a solitary one. He would have to escape, to flee the very land that had shaped him, and in doing so, he would leave behind everything he had ever known, his family, his friends, and the life he had been forced to live. In these formative years, Douglass became a living symbol of resistance, a man who refused to be broken by the cruelty of slavery. But it was a painful resistance, a struggle that cost him much more than he could have ever anticipated. The weight of the system's brutality bore down on him every day, but he also carried with him the knowledge that, despite it all, he could not, and would not, be crushed. His mind, however, was his battleground, and the price of his struggle would be paid in more than just blood. As Frederick Douglass' early education began to take root, it became clear that the pursuit of knowledge was not just a personal ambition, it was an act of rebellion. The impact of his ability to read and write was not simply intellectual. It was an emotional awakening, one that carried with it the psychological weight of his condition, the immense desire for liberation, and the realization that true freedom would not be won without a fight. But this knowledge came with a profound sense of responsibility. Douglass was now aware of his own potential, his worth, and the moral abyss that slavery created. His mind was unshackled, but his body remained bound, and this contradiction fueled the fire of his transformation. Douglass' education was not solely about learning the mechanics of reading and writing, it was about gaining an understanding of the world around him. The texts he encountered weren't just pieces of knowledge, they were windows into a different reality, a reality where freedom was not a mere privilege for a select few, but a birthright for all. Books like The Columbian Orator, with its vivid speeches advocating for liberty and human rights, were nothing short of revolutionary for Douglass. They ignited a flame inside him, a fire that burned away the complacency that slavery had sought to instill in its victims. It was within these pages that Douglass encountered powerful ideas that would shape his mission for the rest of his life, the undeniable power of the human spirit, the inherent equality of all people, and the truth that slavery, as a system, was an affront to both moral and divine law. In the midst of this intellectual awakening, however, Douglass also faced the harsh realities of his situation. As he became more literate, he was met with escalating opposition. The more he read, the more dangerous his knowledge became, not just to those who enslaved him, but to him personally. His newfound understanding of the world around him placed him in direct conflict with the system that sought to keep him under control. The educational system that slavery sought to impose was one of ignorance, silence, and subjugation, and Douglass' growing awareness of this served as a continual reminder of the risks he was taking. Yet, his need for knowledge was insatiable. It wasn't just the freedom to speak, to write, or to express himself that Douglass sought, it was the freedom to know the truth, no matter how painful or terrifying that truth might be. The process of Douglass' intellectual transformation was not a smooth or simple one. It was often marked by moments of deep frustration and confusion. At times, the weight of his knowledge threatened to overwhelm him. The more he learned, the more he realized the depth of his enslavement, not just physically, but spiritually, psychologically, and socially. He began to see that his mind had been enslaved long before his body ever had been. Slavery, in all its forms, had sought to convince him that he was inferior, that his life had no value, and that he was destined to remain a tool for labor. The more Douglass learned, the more he realized how thoroughly the institution of slavery had succeeded in shaping every aspect of his life, molding him into a being who was invisible in the eyes of society, except for the work he could provide. But with that realization came a deep sense of rage. To know that his life, his very being, had been considered expendable, that he was viewed as a mere cog in a brutal machine that fed off human suffering, filled him with a fierce anger. He began to understand that the path to freedom was not just about physical escape, it was about the restoration of his humanity, the reclamation of his rightful place as a person with dignity and worth. This understanding was both liberating and terrifying. To be free required him to confront the very system that had enslaved him. It would mean challenging everything he had ever known, everything he had been taught to accept. But it was in his time spent in Baltimore, serving the Auld family, that Douglass experienced the most significant turning point in his life. It was here that he first tasted the freedom of learning, and also the devastating consequences of its possession. The Aulds, though kind-hearted at first, quickly realized the danger of allowing Douglass to learn. The more he was taught, the more he questioned. The more he questioned, the more he resisted. His intellectual awakening, though born of curiosity and a thirst for knowledge, became a weapon he wielded against the system that held him captive. This duality of freedom and danger, of intellectual and physical liberation, was something Douglass had to grapple with constantly. Douglass knew that in order to survive, he had to become resourceful, and this resourcefulness was not just about securing his own physical safety, it was about learning how to navigate the complex web of oppression and resistance. For every step forward he took in his education, there seemed to be 2 steps backward in terms of personal risk. His progress was not linear. It was a constant push and pull, a tightrope walk between the knowledge he sought to acquire and the punishments that came with it. Each new word he learned carried with it the weight of rebellion, the understanding that in this world of darkness, knowledge itself was revolutionary. Despite the dangers, Douglass' resolve only grew stronger. He was not content with simply surviving, he wanted to break free from the mental shackles that slavery had placed upon him. To do so, he needed to take action. He began to actively seek out other opportunities to educate himself. He learned from the small, everyday moments that passed unnoticed by others. He asked questions, listened to the stories of others, and took every opportunity to gather knowledge. It was in these moments of intellectual engagement that Douglass began to realize that his escape would not just be physical, it would be an ideological one as well. He had to break free from the system's grip on his mind, from the lies and distortions that sought to bind him to a life of servitude. It was during these formative years, as Douglass began to connect with the abolitionist movement, that he began to see how far-reaching his quest for knowledge could be. He began to understand that his freedom was not just his own to claim, but that it was part of a larger struggle, a struggle for the liberation of all enslaved people. He was no longer just a slave trying to escape the chains of his own life. He was becoming a symbol of hope, a living testament to the power of the human spirit to rise above the cruelty of oppression. As his understanding of the world expanded, so did his sense of responsibility. He realized that his voice, his intellect, and his ability to speak and write could be the keys to his, and others, liberation. By the time Douglass had fully embraced the idea of abolition, he had already become a force to be reckoned with. His education had not only liberated him from the psychological grip of slavery, but it had armed him with the tools necessary to challenge the system that had sought to control him. It was in this moment of intellectual and emotional clarity that Douglass became more than just a man, he became a revolutionary. And in this transformation, he set the stage for what would become one of the most extraordinary journeys in the history of the United States, the journey of a former slave who would speak with the voice of a nation. The idea of escape consumed Frederick Douglass long before he physically fled the oppressive chains of slavery. It was an act of profound personal defiance, not just an escape from physical bonds, but from a mental and emotional prison that had defined his entire existence. To flee meant to embrace uncertainty, to gamble everything, and to sever the only life he had ever known. Yet, it was the only option left for a man whose education had illuminated the dark realities of his condition. The more Douglass understood his own humanity, the more unbearable the thought of remaining in bondage became. His escape was not just from the plantation, but from the very system that sought to suppress and dehumanize him. And while freedom was his destination, it came at a brutal cost, the sacrifice of his past, his identity, and perhaps even his soul. Douglass' decision to escape was not made in a moment of rash impulse but as the culmination of years of silent rebellion and intellectual awakening. He had spent years absorbing the powerful ideals of freedom and justice, and yet, the brutal reality of his situation remained unchanged. He had worked tirelessly, read voraciously, and developed a keen understanding of the world around him, but all of it felt futile within the context of his enslavement. Each small step he took toward personal liberation, whether through education or minor acts of resistance, was met with retribution and escalating violence. His physical chains remained unyielding. The system of slavery, with its cold and calculating machinery, showed no mercy. By 1838, Douglass knew he could no longer endure the life of a slave. The sharp sting of his inability to change his circumstances drove him to a final, desperate measure: escape. It was not a decision made lightly. It involved risk, cunning, and the willingness to sacrifice everything: his family, his safety, and even the identity he had cultivated under the cruel constraints of slavery. The possibility of freedom was both a tantalizing and terrifying prospect. Douglass' mind raced with fear and hope as he formulated his plan. He had heard of others who had attempted escape and failed. They had been caught, punished, or worse, made examples of. It was a grim reality that haunted him as he prepared to make his break for freedom. Douglass carefully crafted a strategy, one that involved a combination of wit, bravery, and sheer luck. The route he would take had to be precise. He would travel north, to the free states where slavery had been abolished. However, to reach that haven, he would first have to escape the confines of his plantation. For a long time, he had secretly observed the methods used by slaves who had previously escaped, noting the secret signals, the times of day when slave patrols were less vigilant, and the geography of the surrounding areas. The escape would require him to act quickly and decisively, slipping through the narrowest of cracks in the system. He would need the help of abolitionists in the North, individuals who were willing to aid escaped slaves at great personal risk. It was a high-stakes gamble, a dangerous game with life and death on the line. On the fateful day of his escape, Douglass had already formulated his plan in his mind. He was working on the old plantation, doing his duties as usual, when the moment finally arrived. His heart pounded in his chest as he boarded a train, knowing that every step could be his last. The escape was not just a flight from slavery, it was an audacious assertion of his humanity. Douglass wasn't just running, he was fighting back, defying the very system that sought to control his body and mind. The escape itself was a meticulous process, filled with perilous moments of near discovery. Douglass knew that if he was caught, the consequences would be dire, not just for him, but for the abolitionist movement that he was now a part of. His potential capture would signal to slaveholders across the South that defiance could be punished with unimaginable cruelty. As Douglass moved through the darkened streets and fields, the gravity of what he was doing hit him. The further he moved from the plantation, the more real his freedom became, but so too did the looming danger. He had no guarantee of safety in the North, no assurance that he would find allies waiting to assist him. The terror of being captured was ever present, threatening to swallow him at every corner. Yet, there was a strange exhilaration in his flight, a sense of empowerment that only comes from taking control of one's own fate. It was both a terrifying and liberating experience, a moment when the weight of his years in captivity seemed to melt away as the horizon expanded before him. Douglass' journey northward was not a smooth one. He had to navigate through unfamiliar territories, sometimes by foot, sometimes by hidden routes, relying on the guidance of a network of sympathetic individuals who understood the stakes of his escape. His reliance on these abolitionists, many of whom were part of the Underground Railroad, proved critical. Without them, he would have been lost, swept up by the terrifying force of the law that protected slavery. These individuals provided shelter, sustenance, and vital information that helped Douglass move closer to his goal. In a way, his escape was not a solitary act but one that was facilitated by a network of people working together to thwart the brutality of the institution of slavery. However, despite the aid he received, Douglass' escape was fraught with tension and anxiety. Each day he traveled deeper into the North, he faced the possibility that he might be caught and dragged back to the South. His mind was a constant whirlwind of paranoia. Was he being watched? Was someone in the crowd aware of his identity? He traveled mostly in disguise, presenting himself as a free black man, using any skill he could muster to blend in and avoid suspicion. The psychological toll of this deception was immense. Douglass constantly had to remind himself that this was the price of freedom, that this constant state of vigilance, this mental exhaustion, was the cost of claiming his rightful place in a world that had long denied him the chance to truly live. Finally, after what must have felt like an eternity, Douglass reached the northern states. Upon entering New York City, he breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that he had reached the first haven of freedom. However, even in the relative safety of the North, he knew that his journey was far from over. The legal and societal framework that protected slavery still loomed large. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 ensured that any black person, whether free or escaped, could be captured and returned to slavery if they were found. Douglass' freedom was, therefore, still precarious. But for the first time in his life, he could imagine a future where his actions were his own, where his mind was not enslaved by fear and repression. Douglass' arrival in the North, while a victory in itself, marked the beginning of his most important work as an abolitionist and public figure. His escape had been an act of personal freedom, but it also marked the first chapter of a much larger fight, one that would involve speaking out against the horrors of slavery and fighting for the liberation of others. Though he had won his own freedom, Douglass knew that his work had only just begun. His journey north was not just an escape from oppression, it was the beginning of his transformation into one of the most influential voices in the abolitionist movement. Yet, even as he embraced his newfound freedom, Douglass was haunted by the cost of his escape. The emotional toll of leaving behind family, friends, and a life he had known for so long weighed heavily on him. His departure from the South meant that he would never see his mother again, and that he would be forever separated from the life he had left behind. But for Douglass, this loss was a necessary sacrifice, one that opened the door to a world where he could begin to work toward the emancipation of others. In this way, his escape from slavery was both a personal triumph and the beginning of a larger, collective fight for freedom. The echoes of his decision to flee would resonate far beyond his own life, ultimately influencing generations to come. Frederick Douglass's arrival in the North did not mark the end of his struggles, rather, it was the beginning of a new chapter, a transition from a fugitive slave to a powerful voice that would speak for millions of others. Once he crossed into the relatively safe confines of free states, Douglass found that his personal journey toward freedom was far from over. The brutal realities of slavery, though no longer a direct threat to his life, were still very much a part of the fabric of American society. The freedom he had fought so hard to secure was not just for himself, it was for all those still trapped in the harrowing chains of slavery, suffering in the dark shadows of a nation built on their labor. And it was in the North, among abolitionists and free black communities, that Douglass would find both his voice and his mission. When Douglass first arrived in New York, it must have felt like a mixture of relief and uncertainty. He had escaped physical bondage, but the world before him was vast and uncharted. The North, while a beacon of freedom compared to the South, was far from perfect. Racial prejudice still ran deep, and the threat of slave catchers, especially after the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, loomed large. Douglass was aware that his safety was tenuous at best. However, he was also filled with a sense of purpose that superseded his fear. His new life as a free man could no longer be a solitary pursuit, his freedom now served as a platform to fight for the freedom of others. Douglass's transition into public life was swift and determined. His first significant step was to begin to connect with abolitionists, particularly those who were part of the Underground Railroad, an extensive network of people who aided escaping slaves. These abolitionists saw in Douglass not just a man who had escaped the physical chains of slavery, but a symbol of what was possible, the embodiment of the idea that education and perseverance could overcome the suffocating weight of enslavement. His status as a living witness to the horrors of slavery made him an invaluable asset to the abolitionist cause. It was his public speaking, however, that truly catapulted Douglass to national prominence. His speeches became electrifying accounts of the brutality he had endured, as well as fervent calls for abolition and equality. Douglass's eloquence and power as a speaker were startling to those who heard him for the first time. His narrative, written and spoken, was filled with an emotional depth and an intellectual clarity that made it impossible to dismiss his words as mere rhetoric. It was not simply the content of his speeches that captivated his audiences, but the way in which he delivered them. Douglass spoke not from a place of abstract theory, but from the lived experience of a man who had survived the worst that humanity could offer. His voice rang with authenticity and authority. Douglass's early speeches focused on the personal toll of slavery, the emotional and psychological damage that it inflicted not only on slaves but on the nation as a whole. He emphasized that slavery was not just a Southern problem, it was a national issue, one that threatened the moral fabric of the entire country. His words were filled with a quiet, seething rage that people could not ignore. The image of a formerly enslaved man standing before them, speaking not just for his own freedom, but for the freedom of all those still trapped in the hell of slavery, created a deep sense of urgency among his listeners. Douglass's speeches were more than just calls for abolition, they were demands for justice, for the restoration of the human dignity that had been stripped from him and so many others. One of Douglass's greatest gifts as an orator was his ability to connect with diverse audiences. Whether speaking to a room of abolitionists or to a crowd that was hostile to the idea of emancipation, Douglass had the ability to communicate his message in a way that resonated with people, regardless of their political or social views. This was particularly important as Douglass faced the difficult task of swaying public opinion in a nation deeply divided over the issue of slavery. His message was clear: slavery was a moral evil, and the nation could not continue to live in the shadow of such an institution without suffering irreparable consequences. Douglass was a master at using his personal narrative to illustrate the broader human cost of slavery, showing how it degraded both the slave and the slaver. Despite his newfound prominence, Douglass was not immune to the challenges that came with his growing fame. As his influence expanded, so did the risks. He was now a target not just of the South, but also of those who saw his efforts as a threat to the established social order in the North. Some abolitionists, while sympathetic to the cause, were uncomfortable with Douglass's outspoken and radical stance. They often viewed him as too confrontational, too aggressive in his demands for immediate emancipation and racial equality. For Douglass, however, the time for compromise had passed. He was no longer willing to temper his message for the sake of political expediency. His life had been a testament to the inhumanity of compromise when it came to the question of slavery. For him, every moment of hesitation was a moment of suffering for those still enslaved. Douglass's position was made even more precarious by the legal and social environment of the time. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which made it easier for slaveholders to capture escaped slaves in free states, meant that Douglass was always in danger of being re-enslaved. He had to constantly stay vigilant, knowing that at any moment, a bounty hunter or an enforcer of the law could come for him. This legal framework turned his newfound freedom into a fragile illusion. While Douglass no longer had to worry about physical enslavement, he was still a man who could be hunted, apprehended, and returned to the horrors of the South. The possibility of recapture haunted him, and his speeches were often laced with a sense of urgency, an understanding that the fight for freedom was not over. Despite these dangers, Douglass found solace in the people he met in the North, especially in the abolitionist community. These individuals, many of them white, were risking their own lives to aid runaway slaves and to support the abolitionist movement. Douglass began to work closely with key figures like William Lloyd Garrison, a prominent abolitionist and the publisher of The Liberator. At the same time, Douglass began to develop his own ideas about the path to freedom, which included a deep belief in the power of political action. While Garrison believed in moral suasion, that is, persuading people through non-violent, moral appeals, Douglass grew increasingly impatient with this approach. He came to see the need for more radical action, more direct confrontation with the institution of slavery. As Douglass's voice grew louder, his message became clearer. He argued that slavery was not just a Southern institution, it was a national crime that had to be eradicated completely. And he believed that the abolition of slavery could not happen without the full participation of African Americans. This was a critical point in Douglass's intellectual development. While many abolitionists were sympathetic to the cause of black freedom, few were willing to grant black people full equality. Douglass, however, understood that the fight for freedom was inseparable from the fight for equality. He advocated not just for the abolition of slavery, but for the rights of black people to vote, own property, and participate fully in the political and social life of the nation. In the years following his escape, Douglass began to travel more widely, delivering speeches across the northern states and Europe. His popularity as a speaker grew, and he was in high demand as a representative of the abolitionist cause. His growing influence, however, did not come without personal sacrifice. He lived in constant fear of being discovered and captured, and the toll of this fear weighed heavily on him. But for Douglass, the opportunity to fight for the freedom of millions was worth every risk. His speeches, his writings, and his tireless activism would go on to inspire generations of abolitionists and civil rights leaders, including Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and, much later, Martin Luther King Jr. Douglass's voice was not just a symbol of personal triumph, it was a clarion call for the nation to confront its own moral failings. His escape from slavery, his courage to speak out, and his unrelenting fight for justice transformed him from a fugitive into a national hero. His life was no longer just a personal story, it was a story for all people who had been oppressed, who had been silenced. In the North, Douglass found not only safety but purpose, and in that purpose, he would become one of the most powerful voices in American history. Frederick Douglass's life, from his first steps toward freedom to his emergence as one of the most influential abolitionists in American history, represents a profound transformation. As Douglass began to make his mark in the North, he recognized that his journey had become something much larger than his own personal struggle. The freedom he had fought for was not only about his escape from physical enslavement but about the liberation of an entire nation from the moral and social blight of slavery. His story, once isolated to the confines of his personal experience, soon became a universal call to action for abolitionists, activists, and ultimately for the country itself. Douglass became the voice of a movement, but his rise to prominence was not easy or without challenges. When Douglass first entered the abolitionist fold, he was met with a certain degree of skepticism. His escape from slavery made him an extraordinary figure, but it was also a double-edged sword. Some abolitionists, especially those from the more conservative segments of the movement, saw Douglass's bold approach as risky and too radical. At the time, the abolitionist movement was divided between two schools of thought. One, led by figures like William Lloyd Garrison, championed moral suasion, an emphasis on persuading the public through moral arguments and appeals for gradual emancipation. Garrison's approach focused on peaceful advocacy and nonviolence. On the other side was a more radical faction that believed in direct confrontation, even if it meant political action and violent resistance. Douglass, whose experience of brutality under slavery had given him a visceral understanding of its evil, leaned heavily toward the more direct approach. He understood that compromise was not an option, slavery was an existential evil that demanded immediate eradication. In many ways, Douglass's early speeches bridged these competing ideologies. His powerful oratory skills made him an ideal spokesperson for the abolitionist cause, but his approach to achieving freedom was shaped by the lessons he had learned from his own escape. He did not believe in the gradual, piecemeal abolition of slavery. He argued for immediate emancipation. His personal experience provided him with an unmatched authority to speak on the horrors of slavery, and it gave him the credibility to challenge the more moderate voices within the movement. He spoke not only about the personal pain and suffering that slavery inflicted on individuals but about the institutionalized system that perpetuated it. The more Douglass spoke, the more he became a central figure in the abolitionist movement. His voice resonated with countless people who were horrified by the institution of slavery but unsure of how to end it. Douglass's speeches were electrifying, his vivid descriptions of the brutality of slavery and his calls for immediate action stirred people to their core. As his fame spread, so did his influence. He was no longer just an escaped slave telling his story, he was an intellectual, an activist, and a leader of a revolution. Douglass's role in the abolitionist movement was further solidified when he began to publish his own newspaper, the North Star, in 1847. The paper became a platform for Douglass's philosophy on abolition, civil rights, and social justice. He used the North Star to disseminate not only news about the abolitionist movement but also to argue for the equal treatment of black people. The paper's name was deeply symbolic. The North Star had long been a guide for slaves seeking freedom, and for Douglass, it represented the beacon of hope that would guide his people out of the darkness of slavery. In his editorial writings, Douglass emphasized that the struggle for abolition was not just a political cause, it was a moral imperative, one that transcended race, nationality, or geography. He challenged his readers to confront the idea that slavery was compatible with the nation's stated ideals of liberty and justice. The hypocrisy of a nation that professed to value freedom yet allowed slavery to exist was, for Douglass, an affront to human dignity. As the North Star gained readership, Douglass's voice reached a wider audience. His writing, both in the paper and in his autobiographies, became vital tools in the abolitionist cause. His narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, first published in 1845, was groundbreaking. It was not only a memoir of his own experiences as an enslaved person but also a clarion call for the abolition of slavery. The book was widely read and helped to expose the truth of slavery to the public in a way that was both personal and undeniable. Douglass's eloquence and intellectual depth set him apart from other former slaves who had written memoirs. His ability to express the inner workings of the mind of a slave, and the extraordinary willpower required to break free from that state, was unmatched. He did not just recount the events of his life, he explored the emotional, psychological, and moral consequences of slavery, making it clear that its effects extended far beyond physical brutality. However, Douglass's emergence as a leader in the abolitionist movement did not come without personal costs. His bold stance on immediate abolition and his criticism of the more conservative members of the movement often put him at odds with some of his former allies. Perhaps the most significant rift came with William Lloyd Garrison, the prominent abolitionist whom Douglass had once seen as a mentor. While Douglass respected Garrison's moral commitment to the cause, he grew increasingly frustrated with what he perceived as Garrison's unwillingness to push for more direct political action. Garrison's commitment to nonviolence and his advocacy for gradualism seemed incompatible with Douglass's belief that slavery had to be eradicated immediately and forcefully. Douglass eventually parted ways with Garrison and his followers, choosing to focus on a more political approach to abolition. He felt that to truly end slavery, there had to be direct political pressure and a full-scale challenge to the government's complicity in maintaining the institution. Douglas's split with Garrison marked a turning point in the abolitionist movement. It symbolized the growing divide within the movement between those who believed in moral persuasion and those who wanted immediate and direct action. For Douglass, there was no moral middle ground when it came to the question of slavery. He understood that the institution of slavery was not just an injustice to black Americans, it was a national shame that threatened the very principles on which the United States was founded. His personal experience as a slave gave him an unshakable belief in the need for immediate action, even if it meant challenging the very foundations of American society. In the years that followed, Douglass became a leading figure in the movement, engaging in lectures, debates, and writings that brought the issue of slavery to the forefront of national consciousness. He became not only an advocate for abolition but also a powerful voice for the rights of women, Native Americans, and other marginalized groups. Douglass's belief in the fundamental equality of all people extended beyond race. He understood that the fight for freedom and equality was interconnected. As an ally of the women's suffrage movement, he spoke out for women's right to vote, advocating for equality in all aspects of life, including the ballot box. Douglass's commitment to social justice and human rights made him a trailblazer in the fight for equality, and his influence was far-reaching. Despite the growing prominence of his public life, Douglass remained deeply connected to his personal struggle. The freedom he had gained through his escape was not simply a private victory, it was a shared one. He never forgot the countless men and women who had been left behind, the individuals still shackled by the chains of slavery. His speeches were not just personal testimonials, they were calls to action, demands for a nation to live up to its ideals. Douglass's journey from slave to abolitionist leader was one of both personal liberation and collective resistance. His rise to prominence was not just a matter of achieving individual freedom, it was the beginning of a larger struggle for the liberation of an entire nation from the moral corruption of slavery. As he continued to speak and write, Douglass became more than just a symbol of the abolitionist movement, he became an icon of the fight for freedom, equality, and human dignity. As the 1860s unfolded, the heart of America's national crisis beat with the fierce rhythm of conflict. The issue of slavery, which had long been a divisive undercurrent in American society, was now the very thing that threatened to tear the nation apart. With the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and the subsequent secession of Southern states, the Civil War began in earnest, propelling the question of slavery from a moral debate into an immediate and bloody struggle for survival. For Frederick Douglass, the Civil War represented both a culmination of his life's work and an unprecedented opportunity to finally end the institution of slavery once and for all. But it also required him to navigate an increasingly complex and perilous political landscape, where the very forces of freedom he had fought for seemed both close at hand and at risk of being lost forever. Douglass had spent decades advocating for the abolition of slavery, yet the Civil War brought a new set of challenges and uncertainties. He had long believed that the war, though brutal, could serve as the final catalyst for emancipation. For him, the conflict was not just a war between North and South, it was a moral and existential war between freedom and slavery. The stakes were higher than ever before, and the fate of millions of enslaved people was now bound to the outcome of this violent struggle. Douglass, as a staunch abolitionist and an influential figure in the black community, knew that he had to contribute to the war effort in a way that aligned with his mission to end slavery and secure lasting freedom for all African Americans. From the very beginning of the war, Douglass was unequivocal in his belief that the abolition of slavery should be a central goal of the Union's war effort. He quickly became a vocal advocate for the recruitment of black soldiers to fight for the Union Army. Douglass knew that for the enslaved to be truly free, they would have to be part of their own liberation. He saw the recruitment of black soldiers not just as a military necessity but as a profound symbol of the fight for equality and justice. Douglass's own sons, Charles and Louis, would join the Union Army, and this personal connection to the war effort only deepened his resolve. At the time, however, many in the Union Army and government were reluctant to allow black men to serve as soldiers. There was a widespread belief that African Americans were not capable of fighting or should not be trusted with weapons. This racial prejudice, deeply ingrained in the northern states as well as the South, caused significant tension. Douglass had been advocating for the enlistment of black troops since the war's early days, and he used his considerable influence to push for change. His arguments were simple yet profound. If the Union was to succeed, it needed the full support of all its people, and African Americans, as both free men and escaped slaves, had as much right to fight for their freedom as any other group. Douglass's words were not just political arguments, they were calls for justice. He used his platform to challenge the racial assumptions that kept black men from being allowed to join the military, insisting that their contributions would be crucial to the Union's success. Douglass's tireless advocacy helped to change the perception of black soldiers, culminating in the formation of the United States Colored Troops, USCT, an all-black regiment that played a pivotal role in the war. Douglass's advocacy for black soldiers was not the only way in which he contributed to the Union war effort. His speeches during the war were a combination of impassioned calls for action and philosophical reflections on the larger meaning of the conflict. Douglass viewed the war as the ultimate test of the nation's commitment to its founding ideals. The United States had been founded on the principle that all men are created equal, yet the existence of slavery contradicted that very principle. For Douglass, the war was a reckoning, a moment when the nation would either live up to its promise or be forever condemned as a hypocritical republic. His speeches during this period were filled with both hope and despair. On the one hand, Douglass was optimistic that the Union's victory would bring about the end of slavery. On the other hand, he feared that even if slavery were abolished, the deeply ingrained racism and inequality that had fueled the institution would persist. He warned that the end of slavery would not guarantee equality, and that the nation would need to take active steps to ensure that African Americans were truly free in all respects. In 1863, when President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Douglass saw it as a monumental step forward. The proclamation declared that all enslaved people in the Confederate States were to be freed, though it did not end slavery in the border states or in the areas controlled by the Union. While Douglass acknowledged the significance of Lincoln's action, he also made it clear that the fight was far from over. The proclamation was, in his view, a necessary but incomplete step. It was a military measure designed to weaken the Confederacy, but Douglass knew that true freedom for black Americans would require more than just legal emancipation. He was adamant that the war must continue until slavery was fully eradicated, not just in the South, but throughout the entire nation. The Emancipation Proclamation, though a necessary first step, was only the beginning of a long and difficult struggle for justice. Douglass also recognized the deep challenges and contradictions within the Union Army itself. Though the Northern states had formally declared their commitment to abolition, the racism that permeated society also affected the Army. Black soldiers were often paid less than their white counterparts, were relegated to the most dangerous assignments, and were given the dirtiest and most difficult tasks. Douglass became one of the most vocal critics of this inequality, arguing that black soldiers deserved the same respect, pay, and treatment as their white counterparts. He understood that the success of the war effort depended not just on winning battles, but on proving that black soldiers were every bit as capable, brave, and deserving of recognition as white soldiers. His insistence on the equality of black soldiers was not just a demand for justice for those serving in the Union Army, it was a demand for recognition of black humanity itself. As the war raged on, Douglass's role as a public figure continued to grow. He became a key advisor to President Lincoln, meeting with him several times to discuss the war and the future of African Americans. Their relationship was complicated, but Douglass respected Lincoln's leadership, even while criticizing his reluctance to fully embrace racial equality. Douglass's influence on the president was undeniable. He helped to shape the direction of the war, advocating for policies that would benefit black soldiers and calling for the complete abolition of slavery. Though Lincoln was initially cautious in his approach to emancipation, he came to recognize the vital importance of Douglass's voice in guiding the nation through its most difficult moment. Douglass's presence during the Civil War was not just that of a spokesman for the black community, but as a moral compass for the nation. He understood that the war was about more than just defeating the Confederacy, it was about the soul of the nation. In his speeches and writings, Douglass framed the war as a reckoning for the nation's sin of slavery, one that required full commitment to freedom and equality, even beyond the battlefield. For Douglass, the true meaning of the Civil War lay not in military victories but in the promise of a nation finally living up to the ideals of liberty and justice for all. By the end of the war in 1865, Douglass had witnessed the death of slavery, but he also saw the long road ahead for Black Americans. While the passage of the 13th Amendment and the Union's victory had ended the legal institution of slavery, Douglass knew that the fight for true freedom, social, political, and economic equality, was far from over. The war had been won, but the peace would be just as hard fought. For Douglass, the battle for freedom was not simply about emancipation, it was about ensuring that the promises of the Constitution and the Emancipation Proclamation were fulfilled in the lives of African Americans. The war had freed the enslaved, but the struggle for equality had only just begun. As the Civil War came to an end in 1865, the country was left in a state of devastation. The Confederate South had been defeated, but the work of rebuilding the nation, especially the South, was just beginning. For Frederick Douglass, the end of slavery represented a monumental victory, but he knew that this was only the first step in a much longer struggle. The Reconstruction period, which sought to integrate millions of newly freed Black Americans into the fabric of American society, was a time of immense promise but also profound challenges. For Douglass, this was an opportunity to ensure that the freedom achieved through war would be meaningful, and that the principles of equality and justice would be more than just words on paper. The passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, which formally abolished slavery, was a historic achievement. But Douglass, like many other abolitionists, understood that true freedom could not be secured through legal means alone. Freedom without equality was an empty promise. The question was no longer just about the abolition of slavery, it was about ensuring that the formerly enslaved could exercise the same rights, access the same opportunities, and live with the same dignity as white Americans. Douglass was deeply invested in the idea of Reconstruction because he saw it as the moment when America had the chance to fulfill its ideals of liberty, democracy, and equality. However, the road to Reconstruction was fraught with obstacles. The Southern states, devastated by the war, were reluctant to embrace the social and political changes that emancipation demanded. The racial hierarchy that had supported slavery was deeply entrenched in Southern society, and many former Confederates saw the end of slavery as an affront to their way of life. For Douglass, the challenges of Reconstruction were twofold. Not only did Black Americans need to be integrated into the political and social life of the nation, but they also needed to be protected from the forces that would seek to return them to a state of subjugation. During this period, Douglass became an outspoken advocate for the full integration of Black Americans into American political and civil life. He strongly supported the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted citizenship and voting rights to Black men, respectively. These amendments, he believed, were crucial to ensuring that the former slaves could not only live as free people but could also have a say in the laws and policies that would govern their lives. The passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, which granted equal protection under the law to all citizens, was particularly significant for Douglass, as it provided a legal framework for the fight against racial discrimination. The 15th Amendment, which followed in 1870, gave Black men the right to vote and was seen as a major victory for Douglass and his allies in the fight for racial equality. Despite these legal victories, Douglass's vision for a truly integrated and equal society faced significant resistance. The Reconstruction efforts were undermined by white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which sought to terrorize Black communities and suppress their newly won rights. Southern Democrats, determined to restore the pre-war racial order, actively worked to disenfranchise Black voters, restrict their access to land and education, and maintain a system of segregation. This violent backlash against Black progress was not confined to the South. Racism and discrimination were rampant throughout the country, even in the North, where many white Americans believed in the inherent superiority of their race. Douglass was acutely aware of the fragility of the victories won during Reconstruction. He understood that legal changes alone would not be enough to guarantee Black freedom and equality. He frequently argued that the federal government needed to do more to ensure that the rights of Black Americans were protected, and that any attempt to roll back these rights would be met with resistance. Douglass saw the fight for equality as a continuous battle, one that required constant vigilance, political engagement, and public advocacy. He did not believe that the struggle for racial justice was a short-term cause, but rather a lifelong mission that demanded the full commitment of the American people. Despite the overwhelming challenges, Douglass remained hopeful and determined. His own life was a testament to the possibility of transformation, and he never wavered in his belief that African Americans could, and should, play a central role in shaping the future of the nation. He was a tireless advocate for education, believing that it was the key to both personal empowerment and social progress. Douglass himself had been denied an education for much of his life, but he understood that learning was the pathway to true freedom. Throughout his life, he worked to establish schools and educational programs for Black Americans, helping to lay the foundation for future generations of leaders and activists. In his later years, Douglass's views on race and equality evolved. While he remained a fierce advocate for the rights of Black Americans, he also began to address the broader issues of American democracy. He understood that racism was not just a problem for Black people, it was a problem for the entire nation. As the United States began to grapple with its post-Reconstruction identity, Douglass pushed for a more inclusive vision of citizenship, one that would ensure that all Americans, regardless of race, would have an equal stake in the country's future. He often spoke about the need for a more expansive democracy, one that would fully integrate Native Americans, women, and other marginalized groups into the political and social systems of the country. For Douglass, the fight for racial equality was deeply connected to the larger struggle for social justice. Despite the ongoing challenges of the Reconstruction era, Douglass achieved significant milestones in his personal and professional life. He continued to write and speak publicly about the importance of racial equality, serving as a living testament to the possibilities of Black freedom. His autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, published in 1855, and his later works, including Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, 1881, chronicled not only his own journey but also the broader narrative of the Black experience in America. Douglass's writings became an essential part of the historical record, helping to shape the way future generations would understand the history of slavery and its enduring legacy. As the 19th century drew to a close, Douglass remained an important figure in American politics and social movements. He became a prominent advocate for women's suffrage, believing that the struggle for gender equality was as critical as the struggle for racial justice. He worked alongside women's rights leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, fighting for the inclusion of women in the democratic process. Douglass also remained deeply engaged in international issues, advocating for the rights of oppressed peoples worldwide. His travels to Europe and his relationships with global leaders helped to position him as a symbol of the universal struggle for human rights. Despite Douglass's tireless advocacy for the rights of Black Americans, the country's failure to fully integrate these rights into the social and political fabric meant that the struggle for racial equality was far from over. The end of Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow laws, and the deepening racial segregation in the South ensured that African Americans continued to face systemic oppression long after the Civil War had ended. Douglass, however, was undeterred. He knew that the road to true equality would be long and fraught with obstacles, but he also believed that change was possible. His vision for a more just and equal America would endure, shaping the path for future civil rights activists and leaders. By the time of his death in 1895, Douglass had witnessed some of the most significant social changes in American history. His life had spanned the entire period of slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the beginning of the Jim Crow era. His legacy, however, was not just in the changes he witnessed, it was in the movement he helped to build, and the moral vision he set for a nation still struggling to live up to its ideals of freedom and equality. Douglass's journey was far from over at the time of his death. His work, ideas, and vision for a just America would continue to inspire generations to come. Through his unwavering commitment to justice, equality, and the power of the human spirit, Frederick Douglass ensured that his voice, and the cause for which he fought, would never be silenced. The end of Reconstruction in 1877 marked a critical turning point in American history, and for Frederick Douglass, it was a moment of both personal reflection and profound disappointment. The Reconstruction period, which had promised so much for African Americans, freedom, citizenship, the right to vote, and the hope of equality, was effectively over. Southern states, once defeated in the Civil War, were now able to reassert their dominance over Black Americans through laws and practices that restricted their rights and freedoms. Douglass, who had dedicated his life to the cause of equality, found himself grappling with the harsh realities of a nation that had fallen short of its promises. The systemic racism that had fueled slavery had not been vanquished with the war. Instead, it had found new forms and expressions in the post-Reconstruction era. The withdrawal of federal troops from the South in 1877, following the Compromise of 1877, signaled the end of Reconstruction and left Black Americans in the South vulnerable to the resurgence of white supremacist control. Southern states began passing a series of laws, known as Jim Crow laws, that mandated racial segregation and disenfranchised Black voters. The promise of equality, articulated so forcefully by Douglass and his contemporaries, seemed to unravel before his eyes. The rights that Black Americans had gained during Reconstruction were systematically undermined by violence, intimidation, and legal segregation. It was during this period that Douglass, though still active in advocating for civil rights, began to realize that the fight for racial equality in America was far from over, and that the path forward would be filled with even greater challenges. Douglass had been a tireless advocate for the enfranchisement of Black Americans, believing that voting was the cornerstone of political freedom. When the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, giving Black men the right to vote, it was seen as a triumph of democracy. But by the 1880s, many Southern states had enacted literacy tests, poll taxes, and outright voter intimidation tactics to prevent Black people from casting their ballots. These measures, along with the violent tactics employed by groups like the Ku Klux Klan, effectively nullified the gains made by Black Americans during Reconstruction. Douglass, who had fought so hard for the right to vote, saw this erosion of civil rights as a betrayal of the promises made to the formerly enslaved population. Douglass was acutely aware of the changing political landscape. He understood that the Southern states, having lost the war, had never truly accepted the legitimacy of emancipation or the idea of racial equality. Instead of seeking reconciliation or cooperation, the South had entrenched itself in white supremacy and sought to maintain a social order that kept Black Americans subjugated. Douglass had always been a fierce critic of the system of slavery, but he had also believed that the Union's victory in the Civil War could lead to a more just society. By the late 1870s, he recognized that this vision of a racially equal America was slipping further out of reach. In the face of these challenges, Douglass continued to speak out against the injustices faced by African Americans. His voice remained strong, but the political climate had shifted dramatically. The federal government, which had been a source of hope during Reconstruction, became increasingly indifferent to the plight of Black Americans. President Rutherford B. Hayes's decision to pull federal troops out of the South marked a sharp decline in federal enforcement of civil rights. With the federal government's retreat, Black Americans in the South were left to fend for themselves against the growing tide of white supremacist violence and political disenfranchisement. Douglass's commitment to the cause of racial equality remained unshaken, even in the face of these setbacks. He continued to write and speak out against the conditions facing Black Americans, and he worked with other leaders in the African American community to advance civil rights. However, Douglass also began to recognize the limits of what could be accomplished through political means alone. He understood that the fight for equality was not just a matter of changing laws, it was a matter of changing hearts and minds. While legal victories like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments had been critical, they had not led to the kind of social transformation that Douglass had hoped for. The deep-seated racism in American society continued to thrive, and Douglass saw that the work of building a racially just society would require a much broader cultural shift. One of Douglass's central concerns during this period was the education of Black Americans. Throughout his life, Douglass had believed in the transformative power of education, both as a means of personal empowerment and as a tool for social change. After the Civil War, he had worked tirelessly to establish schools and educational programs for African Americans, believing that knowledge was key to their liberation. But in the post-Reconstruction era, access to education for Black Americans was severely limited. In the South, Black children were often excluded from public schools, or were relegated to poorly funded and overcrowded schools. In the North, racial discrimination in education persisted, with African Americans often being denied admission to better schools and universities. Douglass continued to advocate for the importance of education, but he knew that the struggle for racial equality would also require a much broader effort to combat the ignorance and prejudice that fueled racial discrimination. As the years passed, Douglass's focus began to shift. He had long been an advocate for the political rights of Black Americans, but he also began to address the need for Black economic empowerment. He saw that even when African Americans gained the right to vote and access to education, they were often locked out of economic opportunities. In the South, sharecropping and other exploitative labor systems kept Black people in a state of economic dependence. In the North, Black workers were often relegated to low-paying, menial jobs and were systematically excluded from more lucrative industries. Douglass argued that true freedom and equality required not just political and social rights, but economic independence as well. He believed that Black Americans needed to build their own businesses, secure their own land, and control their own economic destiny. Despite these pressing concerns, Douglass continued to maintain hope for the future. His belief in the possibility of progress was unshaken, even in the face of what seemed like insurmountable odds. He remained active in public life, speaking at conventions, writing articles, and meeting with political leaders. He even served as U.S. Minister to Haiti, a position he held from 1889 to 1891, where he sought to promote the interests of African Americans abroad. Douglass saw the opportunity for Black Americans to look beyond the borders of the United States for inspiration and solidarity. In Haiti, he found a country that, despite its own struggles, represented a vision of Black self-determination. Douglass's time in Haiti reinforced his belief in the importance of global solidarity for Black people, and he returned to the United States with a renewed sense of purpose. As Douglass aged, his voice continued to carry weight, but he was increasingly aware of the limitations of his efforts. The gains of Reconstruction seemed further away than ever, and the tide of white supremacy in the South was growing stronger. Douglass's final years were marked by a sense of frustration at the slow pace of progress, but also by a determination to continue the fight. He remained committed to the principles of racial equality, but he also knew that the struggle would be long and difficult. Douglass's legacy, as a visionary leader and tireless advocate for freedom, would live on in the generations of civil rights activists who followed in his footsteps. He had fought for equality at great personal cost, and though his work was far from finished, his influence would continue to shape the course of American history. By the time of his death in 1895, Frederick Douglass had seen his country change in ways that were both hopeful and tragic. The promise of Reconstruction had been largely unfulfilled, but Douglass's work had planted the seeds for future generations of African American leaders. His tireless advocacy for freedom and equality had inspired a movement that would continue long after his death. Though the challenges of post-Reconstruction America were daunting, Douglass's vision for a racially just society endured, and his legacy as one of the greatest voices in American history remained firmly intact.